Welcome to Unit 7C. This is Lesson 1, and boy do I have some great information for you. Today's lesson is going to be about the various systems of tuning. Because I know that those of you who dabble in the internet come across discussions about these things, and it is very confusing. And it's important to know what you as violinists need to know and what you don't need to bother with. And it's important for you to know what method you're working on while you're doing your 5-minute daily intonation routine. So I did some heavy research for you because it was confusing to me as well. I learned a lot, and I will try to explain to you the best I can what I learned, and I'll share with you the best website that had the greatest, most easily understood information. And there's other great topics on this website as well, so I will include that link for you in your lesson summary. Now, let's talk about the systems of tuning 12-tone scales. You know, when you have one octave, you've got do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, but if you counted all the black and white notes on a keyboard from C to C, you'd have 12 half-step pitches. That's why it's called a 12-tone scale, because they're counting every single half-step. All right, so there are many, many ways of tuning those 12 tones. You'd never realize that it's such a mathematical, complicated procedure, but it is. Way back in 530 BC, a Greek mathematician by the name of Pythagoras discovered that the perfect octave, the perfect fifth, and the perfect fourth were related by perfect mathematical ratios. Their frequencies were related perfectly mathematically. Now, this is really hard to explain what came first, that he noticed that the perfect octave, the perfect fifth, and the perfect fourth sounded perfect, and then he tried to figure out why, or if he was messing around with the frequencies and playing with the math and discovered that at those ratios, when you exactly double the frequency, you get a perfect octave. When you do a ratio of 3 to 2, you get a perfect fifth. When you do a ratio of 4 to 3, you come out with a perfect fourth. And those intervals all sound incredibly pure and perfect. So whether the chicken came first or the egg came first, Pythagoras was the one that discovered those ratios. And based on those ratios, Pythagoras developed a method of tuning the 12-tone scale, which was based on these perfect intervals. Everything else was subservient to making sure that the fifths, the fourths, and the octaves sounded perfect. And this method of tuning became known as the Pythagorean tuning, and it was the common accepted practice all the way into the 1400s, into the Renaissance. The problem with that tuning method is that it made only a couple keys sound absolutely perfect, but if you went into too many different other keys on a fixed pitch instrument, such as a harpsichord or a fretted instrument, not like our violins where we can roll our finger and fudge a note. When the pitch is fixed, other keys sounded horribly out of tune. So it had its limitations as far as how many keys you could play in. In the 1400s, music was starting to get pretty adventurous, and they were starting to use triads. Whereas in the medieval period, it was all about fifths and fourths and octaves. Think Gregorian chant. And that's the kind of intervals they were dealing with. But in the new type of music in the 1400s, they were using triads, which involved a major third. And with the Pythagorean form of tuning, the major third sounded absolutely hideous in other keys, and even in the main key that you were tuned in for the Pythagorean tuning. So in 1482, a Spanish theorist by the name of Bartolomeo de Pareja devised a way of tuning instruments to accommodate the major third into the ratios but also maintaining the Pythagorean perfect fifths, perfect fourths, and perfect octaves. And that method of tuning has become known as just intonation. Shortly after just intonation was invented came mean tone tuning. And I don't know much about mean tone tuning except that it was used commonly in the Renaissance period, and it also was devised to accommodate triadic music, or music that includes that major third. Now, we've discussed the three oldest forms of tuning systems: the Pythagorean, just intonation, and mean tone tuning. It's good to know what those are. The only one you need to remember, and that will influence you as a violinist, is just intonation. And you don't even have to know that much about it. I'm going to discuss at the end of this video how you can apply your practicing to accommodate a happy compromise between just intonation and what the modern practice is called equal temperament. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So later systems in history, after the Pythagorean, just, and mean tone tuning, later systems got even better at accommodating triadic music, but they also became more versatile in being able to play in any of the keys, which was becoming more and more commonplace. Instrumentalists were expected to be able to play in any of the 24 keys. And those later systems accomplished this through what is called tempering. Tempering is the means by which we learned to average out the problem notes. So if a certain note always, by its mathematical ratio, always turned out high, we'd lower it just a little bit and we'd raise other notes to be a little bit closer to it, if that makes sense. So we'd basically average out the discrepancies. We'd compromise on all the notes so that none of the notes would sound horrible, but none of the notes were perfectly in tune either. One of the most well-known forms of systems of tempering was called well temperament. This is the temperament that's believed that J.S. Bach used. In fact, his famous composition, The Well-Tempered Clavier, is to show off the beautiful character that can be evoked through all 24 keys of music using well tempering. It enables a fixed pitch instrument to play in any of the 24 keys, 12 major, 12 minor, without retuning. And while some of the notes are a little out of tune, none of them are horrible. And the added advantage is that every key takes on a very unique character. It's really interesting. I'll include a recording on YouTube of a performance of the Well-Tempered Clavier so that you can hear what Bach is doing. A lot of recordings, they have the nerve to play this piece on equal tempered instruments, which completely defeats the purpose because Bach wrote it to display the different characters of all the keys using an instrument that's tuned to well temperament. But that's getting into details. I'll make sure that the link I include for you is one where the instrument is tuned to well temperament. Today's standard for fixed pitch instruments is equal temperament. And that completely abandoned the Greek ratios of pitch, where everything has to be subservient to those sacred ratios. What equal temperament does is it takes the span of one octave and it divides the pitches equally, 12 ways. So every half step is exactly equal to all the other half steps. In other tunings, the half steps are not equal, which is crazy and hard to imagine, but it's true. So when you hear a piano that's tuned to modern standards, every single note will be exactly at the same distance apart from the next note. This creates problems. It creates some fifths that are a little bit out of tune, but not horrible. They wobble or what people call beat just a little bit. Remember when I taught you about tuning your instrument and I showed you how a fifth that's not quite tuned perfectly kind of wobbles or beats against itself? That happens with keyboards that are tuned to equal temperament, but they're very close. Continue watching because we're about to come to the point where I tell you what you're going to do about all this. First, I want to tell you about expressive intonation. This system of intonation is attributed to the famous cellist Pablo Casals. Obviously, Pablo Casals was a soloist, and this intonation mostly benefits soloists. It gives them greater brilliance and projection to help them stand out over an orchestra. I really like the tension that it adds to a soloistic line. What you do with expressive intonation is you play your major thirds and major sixths a little bit wider. So if you're going to play C major scale, C, D, E, you'd play your E nice and high, because that's your major third. F, G, A, your A, you'd play generously high. Not as high as the major third, but it'd be nice and high. And B, C, your leading tone, the B, is also very high, so it's just dying to become the C. So your major thirds and major sixths, you play higher. Your minor thirds and your minor sixths, you play lower. Exaggerate their lowness to make them more minor. All right, now, by practicing your intonation with a tonic drone, you are learning just intonation. The other name for just intonation is pure intonation. Sounds pretty good to me, right? The problem with only learning absolutely just and pure intonation is that when you combine your playing with other instruments, you'll have to compromise, because although you're playing perfectly in tune, it'll sound bad with other instruments who are tuned to equal temperament. But never fear, I still want you practicing with your tonic drones. You're going to tune your violin just a little bit differently to accommodate your ability to play with other instruments.